Hello, it's me, Beth Rigby, from the Electoral Dysfunction podcast, and I wanted you to know that we are going on tour. Come and see us in our first live shows this September. Our London show is now sold out, but you can still get tickets for our shows in Salford, Liverpool and Glasgow. Ruth Davidson will, of course, be there too.
And both of us with some very special guests, including the legendary broadcaster Kirsty Wark in Glasgow. And of course, we couldn't go on tour without our former co-host, the Labour MP and Home Office Minister now, Jess Phillips. She's going to be joining us in Liverpool.
For all the info about the dates, go to aegpresents.co.uk. We cannot wait to see you there. Hello and welcome to Electoral Dysfunction. It's an Answer the Question special today. Ruth's here as always. Hello, Ruth.
Hiya.
And Thangam Debbonaire is back. She enjoyed it so much. She is doing another episode with us. So, you enjoyed it last time, right?
Absolutely loved it. And I'm loving the fact that this is called Answer the Question. So, like the girly swat that I think I already mentioned, I've got my notes here.
I'm a little bit intimidated.
We love these episodes because we get to hear from you and try to give you a bit of extra insight. So if you have something you want to tell us or a question you want to ask, you can voice note me on 07934 200 444 or send us an email to electoraldysfunction@sky.uk. But we've got to get on with it because we've got loads of brilliant topics to get through, some special advisors to PMQs in the US. Now, our first question is from Abby. She says, I am wondering how someone gets a job as a political advisor or SPAD. SPAD basically stands for Special Advisor. The route seems really opaque. I work in the city in a junior role and would love to work in politics in some form. Now, before we directly answer you, Abby, we should explain what this SPAD thing actually is. Thangam, what does an advisor do? And how many do ministers get?
This is sort of a weird thing because I didn't have a SPAD because I was only in opposition. You have PADs.
Yes.
Explain
what a PAD is.
A PAD is like the equivalent political advisor, but you're in opposition. I had effectively 3, but I really only had 2. And before that, I had 1 when I was shadow leader of the House. And they advise you from a political point of view. They are typically employed by the party.
Yes.
And therefore they are paid to work for the party. You aren't their boss, but they are there to help you to be your best self as a political person, as opposed to your IPSA, Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, funded people who are paid for by the taxpayer to help you to serve your constituents. There is a difference. And the PADs that I had were just amazing people. And SPADs that are now in government, typically people in cabinet will have the most, and the junior ministers won't, but those SPADs will also be there for the whole team, I understand. And obviously the big teams like, say, Treasury, they will have a much larger number because they got blinking loads. And they should have loads because actually Rachel Reeves, as the Shadow Chancellor now as the Chancellor, she needs them because there's a hell of a lot to cover.
And what's really interesting about this, Abby, is that they are political appointees. So they're not civil servants. They are political appointees. So if a cabinet minister gets sacked, loses their job,
that's it.
Their advisors are gone as well.
And it's the same in opposition.
It's the same in opposition.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And when I lost my seat, for instance, my political advisors didn't get to become SPADs.
But when you are in government, there's a couple of things. I've spoken to a number of Labour figures that I have dealt with for a long time, and they are absolutely demobbed. Not only because they are in government, but also, and Thangam, you will totally understand this, they suddenly have civil servant teams. Yes. So they say things like, well, Beth, if you could just contact my private office.
Yeah.
So suddenly what happens when you go into government is you not only do you have your SPAD team, your advisor, your political advisory team, you have a whole machine of government to tap into, right? This is like heaven, isn't it? Thangam, explain why it's like heaven.
Because when you are in opposition, I basically have my two pads, my political advisors, to do everything. And that means that the government's got civil servants to crank the numbers, look at the policy, come up with this, that and the other. Whereas I just got my two people and we worked. I mean, I honestly sometimes think we just did not sleep. And like if I was doing a morning round, a media round, my political advisor and I would both wake up at 4 and start texting each other at 4:30. And that would be having prepped the last night till maybe midnight. Like, I mean, you just keep working. You got to want to do it.
And also, Abby, I should also tell you that when you get into government, say the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, she would have a chief of staff. She would then have a media spad who has to deal with, lucky him, me.
Yes.
She would have a policy spad that I would try and deal with, but they would not want to deal with me.
Would hide away from
And that's just, and then she'll have more than that. And then she also has all of the private office of the Treasury. So you can imagine politically, if you are in opposition against the government, it is a David and Goliath battle here, right?
But you kind of get, weirdly, you can sometimes get off on it, the fact that you are managing it. You are on top of something, and you know that the government's got their whole teams working on something, and you and your pad have managed to get on top of your arguments.
Yeah. And Ruth?
Yes.
What do they do after being spads?
Oftentimes, people that have been spads want to stand for Parliament themselves. So you've had people like the Treasury spad, Rupert Harrison. You've just had elected, and you've got Torsten Bell, who we've talked about in this podcast before, who was a spad for Ed Miliband, who then went off to run a think tank, who has now come back as a Labour MP.
Nick Timothy.
Yeah, exactly. So he was one of the key ones for Theresa May. He ended up becoming an MP. So it is generally very political people and or people that are very passionate in a particular policy area that tend to come in.
And actually, just recently, John Stevens, who is the political editor of The Mirror, he's just gone to work for Pat McFadden.
So he's a really good example, actually, of how in this can be, because he would already have known Pat McFadden. And because Pat McFadden was one of the people that was organising the election, it would have been John's job to have spoken to him and to his team all the way through this election campaign.
And I think that's one of the things I wanted to chuck in here, because I tried to operate in a way which was about talent spotting. So I did hold some open recruitment, but I also targeted deliberately women, particularly women of colour, not for being just women, but because women and people of colour typically will find it quite hard to break into the padocracy. It is a standing joke that the average number of political advisors and senior parliamentary researchers who are white fellas called Tom. I did employ a white fella called Tom, by the way, and he was absolutely superb.
Nothing against white fellas called Tom.
White fellas called Tom, just absolutely not. But it's harder to break into that if you aren't from the typical SPAD class.
So in terms of Abby's question, if you're not already a policy area expert, a good way in where more open recruitments are held, and therefore you don't have to have met an MP or know other people that work in the House of Commons, because that can be quite a closed shop. If you live in a different part of the country, for example, is either working for an MP, as in within their parliamentary or constituency office. And there's often adverts for people to come in as researchers and junior research for a political party. And that's a generalised role. And then you can get fast-tracked once you're in.
Thank you for that, Abby. I enjoyed that question. Now we've got another... Right, this question, you're going to love this one, Ruth. You're going to love it because it's about devolution.
Good. I love talking about Scotland.
So this is from May, who asks, given we have had devolution in Wales and Scotland for 25 years, what is the function and need for a Secretary of State for the devolved countries? Ruth, what do you think? Does the government need a Secretary of State for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland? They've all got one each.
Yeah, I think they do. And I think partly it's because of the fact that we've got devolution rather than just sort of pre-1999 when everything that was separate in Scotland was basically run through the Scottish Office, as it was called then, is now called the Scotland Office. But things in Scotland have been separate for a long time. So, for example, we have always had our own legal system in Scotland. We've never taken English law. We've always had our own education system in Scotland. The Scottish Office of old used to do lots of that. Now, the Scotland Office works for government on the three types of laws that there is. So there is devolved areas of competency, there is reserved areas of competency, and there are shared areas of competency. So, for example, things that are devolved in Scotland are education, health, most transport, some taxes, some benefits, justice. So some quite big chunky stuff. Areas that are wholly reserved are constitution, large swathes of taxation, most benefits, and things like foreign affairs, international development, and also things like defence and security are wholly reserved. And then there's lots of shared areas. So some energy policy is shared, for example. Also, what's interesting, and I'm really getting my geek on here, the way in which devolution happened in the UK is that anything not specifically reserved is de facto devolved. But sometimes something pops up and you didn't know it was devolved. And we had this when I was in Holyrood. So when the phone hacking scandal started, and there was going to be a Leveson inquiry and a new set of rules for how newspapers did things. That was all set up down south, and David Cameron was cracking on with that, and that was all very grand. And then suddenly we realised in Scotland, oh shit, that's not reserved. Therefore, it must be devolved. So we've got to have what we called it, just because we think we're hilarious, we called it Mick Leveson. So Alex Salmond, we didn't have Lord Leveson doing anything. We just decided to piggyback off the back of it. So Alex Salmond suddenly hastily convened a meeting of all of the party leaders. And we ended up having to have this series of leaders meetings about, shit, what are we going to do about newspapers? All of this is a really long-winded way of saying you absolutely need a link, one, for a way for people to access from Scotland, the UK government, so Scottish businesses and interest groups and all the rest of it, to be able to get into and speak to government and other departments, and the Scotland office is a way to do that. But you also need a way for the Scottish government and the UK government to liaise and work together, because more is shared in lots of different ways than you would ever expect it to be. And I think a lot more politics in this country is going to be outside of the House of Commons. And I think actually it's about time that we all paid more attention to each other.
To be continued on a future electoral dysfunction, I feel. I'm predicting the future here.
That was good, Ruth.
You geeked out.
You totally geeked out.
I'm really happy.
We're going to take a break and then we're going to come back. We're back. And we've got a question from Mary Beth. What a great name. She's emailed us from New Hampshire in the US.
Ooh.
God, this is lovely. Okay, I'm just reading this. This is what Mary Beth says. She says, "Hello, my beautiful British babes."
Ooh, nice.
I like
Hey,
that.
Mary Beth.
Hi, Mary
Mary
Beth.
Beth.
This is your number one fan from the USA. This is getting better and better. Your politics are messy, but compared to what's going on in this country, you've got it made, smiling emoji. My question is, has the House of Commons always practiced Prime Minister's questions? While I realise it's a bit of a show, it's much more honest than anything you get here in the USA. I would love to see our president have to be held at least somewhat as accountable as your Prime Minister is.
So just the quick history lesson here for Mary Beth. 1881, I believe, was the first time Prime Minister's questions was introduced. I think I got that right.
I'm loving this.
And it was, it wasn't the first time that Prime Ministers have been held accountable by members of Parliament, and they still are held accountable on other things like ministerial statements. Anyone who followed the Brexit years will know that Theresa May would often have to come to the House of Commons, answer questions for sometimes 2 to 3 hours at a time. Churchill changed this in 1953, or it changed under Churchill to the Tuesdays and Thursdays for 15 minutes. And then Tony Blair changed it almost immediately to the half hour on a Wednesday. I've got to say, under Speaker Bercow, it went from half an hour to sometimes close to an hour. I couldn't answer why John Bercow wanted that to happen, but I think a lot of MPs loved it because it meant that we quite often got to the end of the list, which normally doesn't happen.
Just explain the list.
So the list is what happens. Sorry, you got me on my geek now.
Yeah, I'm just loving this geek off.
So the geek off is fully on board now. So the list, it comes from a thing called the shuffle. And if you want to put a question in, which most voters, I had to explain this because they said, why can't you ask a question at Prime Minister's questions? You can't just ask a question. You have to put in a bid, and you put in a bid for the same question. Everybody is basically asking to ask the Prime Minister to list their engagements. Now, there are questions to every Secretary of State, actually, and I would often say to constituents, watch some of the others because they're even more interesting in some ways, but less theatrical. You put your bid into the shuffle. I can't remember now, I'm so out of the loop, but I think it's Monday. And the shuffle happens, which is literally a lottery. Assembly, and it was called a shuffle because it literally was a shuffle of bits of paper. It isn't anymore, but it's a lottery. And you then get listed in order of who's going to be asked a question. It doesn't go in that order because the Speaker has to go opposition, government, opposition, government, and they have to get in the leader of the opposition as early as possible, and they get 6 questions. Then it has to go back to the government and then to the second party of opposition. So it was the SNP. Now, the shuffle meant that if you were down at the bottom, you probably weren't going to get asked until Mr. Burko comes along and just keeps it going. But if you've ever watched and you wonder, I'm not going to demonstrate because I'd miss the mic, what that standing up and down thing is, it's not people doing their exercises to tighten their glutes, although that is like a side benefit. It's called bobbing, which is how you catch the Speaker's eye. In fact, if you have a particular reason to want to ask a question, say there's been something absolutely awful happening in your constituency, you would go and have a word with the Speaker beforehand or one of his staff and say, really need the Speaker to call me in PMQs, even if you're not on the list.
Yeah.
But in general, what the Speaker is supposed to do is to try and stick to the list, go back and forth. But because it's a shuffle, some days you will get a lot of government MPs, which means that it's what's called a good opportunity for opposition backbench MPs because they're more likely to get called on the bob.
Now, that I didn't know.
That's a geeky thing,
So
but you get to learn this sort of stuff.
Can I also just say, I know Ruth wants to jump in, but also journalistically, the other thing that we find interesting is that if the government is having a particularly difficult time, you look down the list and you work out who's a troublemaker that has a question today. And then we'll be like, so-and-so is going to ask him something. It's going to be really awkward. So that is another thing about Prime Minister's questions that journalistically we all look out for.
I think one of the other things that I wish people would do more, and you know, it's easy for me to say now because I'm neither in government nor opposition, but I used to want us all to coordinate more. And PMQs, I think, was its toughest for the Tory Prime Ministers when my colleagues were selfless enough to go, hang on, they didn't answer the first question. And if you were on question 4 on the list, you'd say, further to what my colleague just asked, can the Prime Minister have another go at giving a decent answer? And it worked at its best when there was no let-up. Every single backbench MP went, you didn't answer.
We sometimes do that in press conferences as well.
It's a good thing to do, and it's generous because you're giving up your question for what you wanted. You wanted to say, will the Prime Minister join me in congratulating the 3rd Scout Troop of my constituency?
That's what they want.
And that's what they want because that's how you get in the local press.
Yeah.
But actually, as a team player, your job really ought to be, you didn't answer the question, Prime Minister, have another go. I mean, PMQs is interesting to watch.
Boris is a good Prime Minister to do that to because he wouldn't have a huge grasp of detail necessarily and also wasn't super disciplined. So he might either be shown up of not knowing anything other than that one line he gave in answer to the leader of the opposition, or he might overshoot and say something he didn't mean to because he didn't have that discipline. Whereas somebody like Theresa May was dreadful to do that to because nobody thought that she didn't know because everybody knew that she read her briefs every night. So she was well on top of it, but she had extraordinary discipline in never going beyond what she wanted to say, which is rubbish in an election campaign, but was good. But is good at PMQs. Can I just say one thing about the difference between America and prime ministers and presidents?
Yeah.
The difference between a prime minister and a president is that the prime minister is not the head of state. That is our king or queen in this country. The prime minister of this country is the first among equals. So they are just part of the cabinet. Now, they might be the Prime Minister, but they are, in every other sense of the Constitution, another minister. And if parliamentary time is given to every minister to answer questions on their portfolio, then it is also given to the Prime Minister to answer questions on his portfolio, which just happens to be the whole of government. So the constitutional difference is that because we have a cabinet constitution, of which the Prime Minister is only the first among equals, it is imposed upon him or her that they must come before Parliament and ask an answer to their brief, to their portfolio, in the same way as every other Secretary of State must do. But I think it's a good discipline for Prime Ministers. The idea that they actually have to be across everything and they've got to be questioned on everything or anything, that they've got to be good on their feet, that they've got to be well informed about what their government is doing, and that they can't skate by. So I think America would love it if their leaders were questioned in that way and they had some sort of organised question time, whether it was by the media or by other, because there's an appetite for it. Like, people love watching it. I love watching the White House spokesman on the platform do the media round. Like, I love it. But they're not elected. Like, they have they can be fired, they can whatever, you know?
But I guess that's the closest they have, because in the US, of course, they have this separation of powers between the executive, the legislature and the judiciary. And there's a stronger separation of powers between the executive and the legislature. So the president isn't as directly accountable to Congress as our Prime Minister is in the Commons, because our Prime Minister is of the Commons, right? Yes. So he's an MP as well as being the head of government. So they don't really have that kind of need to go to Congress in the way that...
They don't, and they do the State of the Union, don't they?
Yeah.
As anyone who's watched The West Wing will know. And that's a very interesting way of being accountable, but it's not the same.
Well, look, thank you, Mary Beth, for that question. I guess the closest you have is the White House briefing, but that's for journalists rather than politicians to ask questions of the president and his team. It's quite iconic, that, because it's right by the West Wing. And when we get to go to the Oval Office occasionally, as we have done, all the British journalists stand behind the podium and have photos taken. And all of the US press corps look at us like we are total idiots and losers, which I think we probably are. But anyway, what I normally do is stand there and say, I will not be taking any questions at this time, which I absolutely love it. Okay, we haven't actually got time for one last question, but we're going to do it anyway. One last question from Rebecca. She sent us this in a voice note. I love a voice note. Let's hear it.
Before the news reports about Labour finding a black hole in government finances, I was just wondering, given that Rachel Reeves has been Shadow Chancellor for a few years, would you not have any visibility over the finances already? It just seems a bit odd that it's quite a surprise.
Well, Ruth, in the past few weeks, Jeremy Hunt has criticised Rachel Reeves and said she should have known how much money there was. Will you just explain how it works? And has Rebecca got a point here?
So we've talked about Rachel Reeves before on this, and the fact that politically she's trying to build up a narrative that things are even worse than we thought they were, and that's why, as a new Labour government, we can't do all the things we want to do, or that we have to do some things that are quite unpopular. So that's her political motivation for doing all of this. The idea that she doesn't know what the finances are both has some truth to it and is also completely laughably wrong. So some truth in that you don't get into the very guts of the figures until you're really into the departmental small print. So you do have to be in government to properly see all of the engine. However, the idea that some of the things that she added into that total that made this £22 billion black hole that she talked about is nonsense. And we all knew it was nonsense. And in fact, if you'd paid attention during the election campaign, almost all of the questions to anybody even vaguely related to the Treasury or to the leadership was about how are you going to afford to do this because XXX. So we did know about it. There's also institutions in place to tell you about it. So in 2010, one of the first things that the Cameron Osborne government did was to set up the OBR, which is the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is a quasi-independent or independent organisation that's supposed to scrutinise and publicise the sustainability of political budgets, to try and make sure that governments are responsible for the long-term fiscal and economic health of the country, not just trying to see themselves through to the next election to gain a bit of traction in areas that they have to win at the ballot box. But some of the stuff that she picked out, so things like public sector pay settlements are worse than we thought. Were they really, Rachel? Because that's all been really public. So I think that's a bit of a scam. So try to add that in. And if that is such a big problem that she outlined, you know, they've just given 15% to junior doctors, they've given above inflation to some transport workers. So I think there's an element, and I would say this because I'm a Tory, but there's an element of a bit of trying to have your cake and eat it.
I would say this because I'm Labour, but you know, the reason that Rachel Reeves and my colleagues are having to give a pay rise to a lot of public sector workers is because they were denied one for many, many years on an excuse which was also a complete fallacy, which is the Tory government of, well, the coalition government of 10 to 15, who continually said Labour crashed the economy and maxed out the country's credit card. There was a global financial crisis. I am so sick of having to explain that to people. And I know you know that too, Ruth. So we're just going to finish on a tiny bit of disagreement because we've been having a bit of a love and agreement throughout the whole thing. But also, I think I've got to say, I took part in access talks as a Shadow Secretary of State, and you definitely don't get all the detail. You just don't. And it's amazing how much people think is just known by everybody. Plus, as we talked about earlier when we were talking about political advisors, when you're just you as a Shadow Secretary of State and a couple of political advisors, you're going to have to cover an awful lot, which the government has a whole civil service to be able to find cunning ways to put in a footnote. It's not as easy as people think, but I also think, you know, Rachel's a politician. Of course she's going to have to make a political case, just like the coalition government made a political case out of something that wasn't true, which was Labour maxed out the country's credit card and spent all the money. That was never true, but it made a good political weather for quite a long time, and I think helped keep Labour Party out of government because the Tories made a good narrative out of it. I've got to hand it to them. And I think Rachel's doing a cracking job of making a great narrative out of the fact that not everything was known, because not everything was. Whether or not some things were known and she's whatever, it kind of doesn't matter because it's building a picture, which is that the Tory governments of the last 14 years have done something profoundly damaging to our economy by failing to address numerous things, not confined to the fact that doctors do need a pay rise.
And in the same way that you're talking about having to give a 3-paragraph explanation of there was a global financial crisis, etc., our side are going to spend quite a long time talking about the global pandemic and the Ukraine war and the disruption. But as I've said previously, this is the danger period for the Tories because you guys as a new government have the biggest microphone and are able to tell a much bigger story about the last 14 years than we're able to defend. And in the same way that we pinned so much on you, and, you know, I could still kiss Liam Byrne for the note that said there is no money left, you know, we actually didn't start that narrative of you didn't fix the roof while the sun was shining. You maxed up the country's credit card. Gordon Brown's the man that sold the gold. You know, we did all of that after we were in power. Like, that's not how we got to power. We absolutely nailed that on you after we got to power. And it critically damaged you in future elections. So, she's laid a foundation. She's going to have to keep it going because it's gone a bit quiet. She's going to have to keep it going if she wants to nail this on us. And you know, we've got a big target. We had 5 prime ministers in there, none of whom agreed with anything that anybody else before them had said. There's no narrative for our time of the last 14 years that's a through line. There's loads of contradictions. So you're going to have to pick which thing you choose is the most damaging for us. And then you're going to have to stick to it and you're going to have to keep repeating it because
I think we learned from the coalition
but it works. I mean, in terms of pure politics and pure theatre, we absolutely made the weather with that narrative.
All right, well, thank you both. And thank you, Rebecca, for that question. That was good, wasn't it? I'm looking forward to that budget where Rachel Reeves now probably has to raise taxes. I mean, as we said in the election, when Keir Starmer said, we have no plans, and I said in our interview, I said, no plans means they might. I'm going to get that clip, I'm going to dust it down and I'm going to retweet it or re-exit, whatever it's called. Anyway, that's all we've got time for. I'm so sad about that. I could go all day on this.
We could.
If you've got anything you want to ask us, send it to the burner phone 07934 200 444 or email us at electoraldysfunction@sky.uk. We love hearing from you and we always try to answer as many of your questions as we can. And do not forget, you can come and see us in September. Ruth got her wish and we are on tour. We are sold out in London, but there are still tickets in Salford, Liverpool and Glasgow. Now, Jess Phillips, you might remember her. How could we forget Jess? Jess is going to be joining us in Liverpool and Kirsty Walk is our guest in Glasgow. And we have more guests, which we will be announcing soon. All the details in the show notes of this episode. But for now, we are off. Thangam, thank you for joining us again.
Thank you so much.
And thanks both for geeking out. I really...
It was a geek off,
We did get our geek on. We did get our geek on.
I feel like I really got like my money's worth there with the geek off. So, okay, we will see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.